In this phase of the project, I would like to show you how I added the epoxy fill to the table. I took a simple fiberglass mesh cloth and I made sure that it was cut at least a half an inch over the split section of the table. I then used a clear epoxy to adhere the fiberglass mesh cloth to the wood table. You can be very generous with the amount of epoxy used during this stage. This is the bottom side of the table. No one will see it, and you want to make sure that you create a clear surface that will not allow the color epoxy to spill out of. So you want to eliminate any holes. You want to make sure that the edges of the fiberglass mesh do not have any folds or creases in them. And you want to make sure that you're also very generous with the clear epoxy at this point in time. You want to do this to the bottom side and the side of the table to create a solid border. After applying 2 to 3 layers of the fiberglass mesh, you're going to want to let the project set for at least 24 to 48 hours later before you start the color epoxy fill. When adding the color epoxy, you want to make sure that you follow the manufacturer's instructions regarding the A to B mix. My instructions gave me equal parts A to equal parts B. I'm also going to add color acrylic pigmentation to the epoxy, which I just wanted to use just a little bit. You want to make sure that you mix the epoxy thoroughly. Now you're ready to pour the mixture into the split opening of the table. It took me about 4 or 5 different batches of the epoxy to completely fill in the table. Along that process, I noticed that there were a lot of splits within the natural tabletop, and I filled those in with the epoxy mixture as well. The wood naturally soaked in a lot of the epoxy directly after I poured it into the cracks in the surface. So then I wanted to go back over the areas with more epoxy, and then the areas that did not take the epoxy, I kind of scooted that mixture into the crack surfaces. That way it will create a fully smooth, filled in, no air bubble surface. And 24 hours later, my table has fully dried from the color epoxy fill. You can see that it overlaps the top surface, but it has hardened, and I could even touch it. Now it's time to use the planer to get the surface smooth. Using a simple electric hand planer, I was able to basically shave off the top layers of the epoxy that overfilled the surface and got my tabletop back smooth. After using the planer, I noticed that there were a few holes still in the top surface, so I will go back and fill those in with the color epoxy and repeat the planing process over again. Now that I've filled in all of the gaps and spaces on the surface, I'm going to use the orbital sander to sand the surface down completely smooth. My next step is adding a natural finish stain to the top of the surface. I'm going to make sure that I apply at least 4 to 5 coats of a natural wood stain to the top and the sides, making sure that it dries about 24 hours in between each stain coat. Now it's time to apply the last and final coat of clear epoxy to the tabletop. This is going to give the table a very clear, glossy, shiny finish, almost like a bar top table. Now it's time to apply the legs to the tabletop. I found these simple pin legs online. They're steel. They already came with a bracket attached to them and screws to adhere to the table. Make sure that you set your legs in place so that way it does not overlap where the epoxy color is, and you're ready to screw the nails into the wood base. Once the table legs have been set in place, it's time to set the table upright and enjoy. I hope you enjoyed this video and like my page. Thanks.